I hear you were up in the big smoke the other day, Hannah.
Down in the big smoke.
Oh, down. I think, isn't it always up to London?
Oh, no. It is if you're like me and you're from Kent. It's definitely is.
Being a Brummie, it was definitely down to London, to Butcher's Hall.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
Where was my invite? I would have loved to have been your +1.
I had to sit on a panel, so I did I earned my supper.
And how was the supper?
Very good.
What did you have?
A lovely bit of British lamb, although I could have done with a bit more.
Can't we all say that, actually?
Hello and welcome to Agonomics with
Tom,
Hannah,
and me, Charlotte. Coming up in your weekly dose of economics of agriculture, we'll be revealing the results of AHDB's Planting and Variety Survey.
yes, hot off the press, cabbage stem flea beetles, comparison of your milling wheat to your feed wheat, and what implications have the weather had going forward for this year in cereals.
The conditions for planting and growing the 2024 crop were so exceptionally bad, and improvement is not difficult to come by.
I've been finding out what happened when buyers from the Americas, Africa, Asia and the Middle East took part in AHDB's biggest ever inward mission for the red meat sector.
We've got 17 meat exporters upstairs, and they're in the session now, technically business to business, but I like to call it speed dating.
And don't forget, we're here to help answer those questions that you've always pondered over, but hadn't dared ask. That is until you got in touch with the crack Agonomics team.
Best way to get in contact with the A-team is through the show's email, agonomics@ahdb.org.uk.
And a reminder, new shows drop every Wednesday at midday, so follow us wherever you listen to podcasts to make sure you don't miss an episode.
So before we move on to the Planting and Variety Survey, where we will be joined by Helen, let's have a quick look at the news. So, Charlotte, what have we been looking at?
Well, I've seen, which I thought was really interesting, that the pig industry is calling out for placements for some of its students. So something that AHDB does in conjunction with the NPA, so the National Pig Association, and Harper Adams University, is that they look for potential sponsors within the pig industry to help get experience to undergraduates. So I think actually really important. We know that it's really difficult for young people to get into farming. So if anyone listening potentially thinks that they might be able to offer a placement for a student, it's a great way to get a year-long's worth of interviewing in. You might find your next star, like we see with Caleb and Harriet and Clarkson's Farm, because we were talking about that earlier. Why don't you reach out? There's some news on the AHDB website. I think it's also featured in Pig World. But yeah, have a look, see if it's something you might be able to offer an upcoming student. How about you, Tom? What have you been looking at?
So I think quite big news when it comes to the red meat sector is the UK has been downgraded its BSE status, and it's now sitting at negligible, something that's been very wanted from the industry, and will hopefully look at increasing our exports in the long term.
Very topical then, really, with all the trade talk that we've had the last few weeks.
100%, especially with all the different trade deals we're making, or whether they're tariff agreements. There's lots of movers and shakers there. So to have that under our belts as a key offering for the UK is very important going forward. So with BSE having such an impact on trade, I know, Hannah, that you were particularly involved in some trade discussions earlier last week. Go on, let's have a little bit of an insight. What did we learn? What did we do? What was it about?
So yeah, last week I was lucky enough to be part of AHDB's Pasture to Plate inward mission, the biggest ever for red meat for AHDB, which is fantastic. It was a 4-day programme which ran from the 2nd to the 5th of June, and it saw 28 exporters and international delegates getting under the skin of the British industry. So there were visits to farms and processors in the West Country, really to learn more about how we produce our world-class beef, lamb and pork. The event culminated with a Meet the Buyer event and a fabulous gala dinner at Butcher's Hall in London, which is the heart of the British meat industry. beautiful stained glass windows. If you've never been, I would recommend a visit. And that was attended by exporters and UK government representatives. So I caught up with Jonathan Eckley, who is Head of Exports at AHDB, on the final day of the week to find out more about the pasture to plate inward mission.
We've got 28 international buyers here in the UK, from Canada, America, Mexico, the Middle East, across to Asia. So we can show them firsthand our quality beef, lamb and pork production. On export promotion, we have a tactile product, so we want people to touch and taste that. Our standards here in the UK are world class, so it's really important that we get these buyers from around the world to come and experience that firsthand. So those 28 buyers, they arrived on Sunday. This year we've based the mission around the southwest. We did a pilot one in 2023, which we took up to Yorkshire, where we had 12 buyers come in to pilot the programme and do farms and abattoirs, and it was successful. So we targeted 20-25 buyers, so really excited to get 28 here this week. So we've had people that are interested in beef, and they went to a beef plant, pork to a pork plant, and the lamb buyers down to a lamb plant in Dorset. So we can get them into the factory so they can see firsthand the standards that we're producing to, particularly in food safety, which is really important in global markets, that they can trust the product we sell. We have a great story to tell on the farming side of it as well. So we visited, those delegations visited beef and lamb farms to look at the standards we operate at and show them really how we care about the welfare and walk them through the supply chain from that pasture to plate, as it's called. So that's all really important to show that firsthand to these guys. The week culminates here in London. We're in Butchers Hall, which is the heart of the British meat industry. So those 28 buyers have come. We've done a panel discussion with them to talk about our production standards and talk about the data that underpins everything we do at AHDB. But really importantly, we've got 17 meat exporters upstairs, and they're in the session now, technically business to business, but I like to call it speed dating. We all know once we've met somebody to 10 or 15 minutes and we've had that face-to-face conversation, it's much easier to communicate with them. So although this is the last day, it's the most important bit of that. We've shown them the wonderful production we've had really good feedback from those guys today, but the conversations that are happening upstairs will be really important in building those all-important relationships. The international meat business is all about relationships, and that's what we're doing, is helping our exporters build those with key stakeholders.
There's a lot going on, as always, but especially at the moment, it seems, in the global meat market. What are you picking up from exporters in terms of opportunities and challenges that they're facing at the moment? I mean, we just had news on the SPS with the EU, for example, so that's an example of where, you know, trade friction is hopefully going to be reduced.
Really interesting world out there right now for lots of different reasons, whether that's conflict impacting global trade flows, the economic situation and the political situation. So there are some challenges in the market. What I'm picking up from people is, yes, there are challenges. Where there's a challenge, there's an opportunity. And, you know, where there might be some losses, there might be opportunities elsewhere. It is a difficult world right now, can't underestimate that. And the biggest challenge, of course, with all that is the uncertainty on the markets, which is not helping things. However, you know, record value of exports last year, driven by high prices. I think the Q1 data I looked at the other day for the sheep meat sector, that's really exciting because that's in a positive space. As I said in the panel discussion, Anuga is our biggest event of the year. It's our biggest investment at trade shows, which is in Germany in October. It's the biggest trade show in the world this year. It's a truly global show. And just the example of that is, you know, I was in China 2 weeks ago, in our biggest pork market. We had 90 square metres. We've got nearly 400 at Anuga, so that's how big that show is. And I think while those challenges are there, everybody's still focused on the opportunity that is going to be in the longer term, driven by population and income growth. Anuga this year, we've been completely overwhelmed by the demand from exporters, which is actually a really great problem to have. It is a problem because we have to disappoint people because we can't quite allocate the space we want. But I think that demonstrates the appetite there is to continue showcasing the significance of meat export to the UK, and importantly all the work we're doing through trying to gain access to more markets, to broaden the portfolio, to give us more opportunities and offset risk. It's all about building the reputation as the UK as a really good place to produce quality beef, lamb and pork, and that's safe, that consumers can have trust in.
Speed dating. I love the sound of that, especially paired with a fancy gala dinner. So Hannah, what were you doing there at the event? I'm sure you weren't just there for a nice jolly, were you?
I mean, the dinner was fantastic. I did only get one lamb cutlet, and I wish I had more because it was delicious. British produce.
We'll put in a request for next time for you, shall we?
Definitely. So I was there on a panel with head of market access Waffa and Jono, and we were setting the scene really with British export and where we sit in the global context, and saying how important it is for the sector in terms of carcass balance and diversifying our market access for the various cuts, because we trade because our domestic market has preference for certain cuts, and overseas markets such as China, for example, have a huge market for offals. Pig offals in particular are a real bright light for UK export.
They're not quite so liked over here though, are they?
No. Do you know what? I think we should do some product development. I think we should make offal ready meals. Ooh. Because it's fifth quarter, it's utilising the carcass, and it's quick and convenient, and that's what consumers want.
It's time now to take a short break, and afterwards we'll be heading to Helen Plant, where we will be talking about the planting and varieties survey.
Hi, I'm Annabelle Twinborough, Analyst at the AHDB, here with a look at the domestic dairy market for the week commencing 2nd of June. Favourable dairy economics have continued to boost milk production, with GB volumes up by 5.8% year-on-year for the milk season so far. A downturn in milk deliveries for the week ending the 10th of May suggests we have now passed the flush, which reached a record peak this year. Milk price announcements are mostly steady, with declines in prices for a few processors, but the milk-to-feed price ratio still looks to be extremely favourable. The UK wholesale market was reasonably stable in May despite soaring milk volumes. Butter was an exception, firming up to £6,060 a tonne on tight stocks. Bulk cream saw the biggest decline, with average prices down by £87 a tonne to £2,538. SMP and mild cheddar reduced to stand at £1,970 a tonne and £3,950 a tonne respectively. For the latest data and analysis on red meat, dairy and arable markets, head to ahdb.org.uk and click on Markets and Prices.
Welcome back to the Agronomics podcast with Hannah, Tom and me, Charlotte. And we have been joined today, very excitingly, by our first guest of this revamped Agronomics podcast. And we are joined today by Helen Plant. Now, Helen was very kind to chat to me earlier because I was very honest and said, what on earth is a planting and variety survey? So do you mind if we maybe start off there? Because I'm sure there might be some listeners who also are less sure about what it actually entails.
Absolutely. So this is our first assessment of what the cropped area is for the coming harvest. And it's been very, very kindly filled in by lots of farmers across the UK, sharing their data with us. And it enables us to pull together this view of what crops are in the ground now compared to this time last year, not just at a crop level, but what sort of varieties, what target markets could these crops be headed for as well.
And I know something you mentioned earlier is that normally we would sort of look at this a little bit later in the season perhaps, so more like July, but this year it was actually done in June.
Yeah, so we started slightly earlier and we've condensed how we've processed the data and how we've done that, and using new technology and things help us speed that process up. The idea is that we are getting this data out to levy payers sooner, both growers and the trade, in time for now. At the moment, people are looking at not just what are we likely to harvest this year, but making their planting decisions for harvest 26 as well. So thinking is the sooner they have the data, the sooner they can be using some of that in their thought processes and how it might impact, if at all, what is going in the ground for next harvest as well as this one that's coming up.
Because that was something that I know I hadn't appreciated, and I'm sure that both, Tom and Hannah will have, that decisions are having to be made by your farmers before they've even harvested what they had to decide on last year. When it comes to the survey, is that something that can help them with making those decisions?
I think so, yeah. So if you're aware of what the prospects are looking like for the year that's coming, you've got that in the back of your mind then as to what might be available in the year ahead, and then potentially then putting you on a strong footing to have conversations with merchants, trades, the people you normally deal with when you're looking further ahead, and sort of certainly for crops that require contracts, or making those marketing decisions about what might be required for sort of 12 months time again on from here.
So to the results section. Yes. So I'm sure many listeners and people in the room with me today have either halfway through or finished Clarkson's Farm, and everyone is recalling last year's exceedingly poor planting season with a very mild weather over the winter, and then it just did not stop raining. So the big question is, what are things looking like for this year? Have things improved, Helen?
Short answer is yes. I mean, to be honest, the conditions for planting and growing the 2024 crop were so exceptionally bad, and improvement is not difficult to come by. But what I would say is there's still been notable challenges. It's varied across the country a little bit, but there are still challenges for this year. And I think if I start with sort of the wheat, which is the main cash crop for a lot of farms, we're looking at a 6% rise from harvest 24 in terms of the amount of hectares that are in the ground at the moment. Now, that is a rise, but when I was chatting to people probably this time last year about their plans and sort of cereals event last year, a lot of people had hoped to get a bit more in again. So it shows the weather impact. When we look regionally, certainly across southern England, many farms there didn't manage to get that increase in plantings in. We've got decreases reported for the southeast and southwest of England.
Have we got any particular standout varieties? I know it's not just the planting survey, it is the varieties as well, or possibly any longer term trends that are coming through.
So if we hold on with wheat on the sort of variety side, the survey points to less of the UK flour millet group 1s and 2s. These are varieties suitable for bread making that have gone in the ground. I think that while fertiliser prices are lower than they were a couple of years ago, thankfully, they are still higher than they were sort of before the war in Ukraine started. And with premiums for bread wheat having come down a bit in the last couple of years, it's providing more of an economic challenge for people. And I think that would have factored into their decisions about when choosing what variety, which grouping to plant, and how that's come through.
We've seen a really different year this year, Helen, haven't we, weather-wise? And we always like to complain about the weather. It's always too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry. What have we seen in terms of impact on planting and conditions so far in 25?
Yeah, it's been a mixed picture. So we had a really wet September. Well, I suppose if you start from the very start, the oilseed rape went in reasonable conditions, sort of late August, early September. Then everything turned wet. And that's reduced the winter barley area. I think a factor in why we haven't seen as big a rise in the wheat area as well. Later in the autumn, things dried up and we had a bit more typical weather over the winter. But even so, crops didn't have the best of starts in the autumn. Then, as you say, coming through to the spring, very dry conditions through March, April, May for most of it. That was a bit of a double-edged sword from a cereal grower's point of view. The positive was that it meant they could get on the land, get planting, get everything in. And part of the reason I think we've seen an increase in some of the oat area year on year, and also a smaller fall in spring barley plantings, down about 6% year on year, than we might have thought before Christmas. But it's then come through in the challenge in terms of crop conditions. We did see quite a notable fall in crop condition scores between the end of April and the end of May. We've thankfully had some rain since, but there's still quite a lot of uncertainty about what impact that's had. And, well, yes, things are looking a bit greener. It's still watch and see at this point, and uncertainty about how much of each crop is going to be produced.
Yeah. As a livestock farmer's perspective, I'm quite interested in the amount of straw that's going to be around. If a lot of these crops are sort of short in their stems and stunted, that obviously has a knock-on effect. I mean, there's a lot of other impacts on the amount of straw, like how many people decide to chop, What do you think's the kind of prospect for straw and straw markets on the back of this year? It's big question.
Big question. Yeah, absolutely. You've highlighted a lot of the key factors there, to be honest. Starting from this point, it would be a potential pressure on straw availability. I mean, looking at total cropped area for cereals is up slightly on the year, but only up slightly in total. And then, as you say, we've got a lot of shorter crops about. And from a barley perspective, particularly less tillers than usual, so less stalks coming up, which then would in turn reduce the amount of greenery available to be turned into straw. But we're not at the final point yet. Harvest weather, decisions on incorporation versus chopping, prices, all of that filters in from here on in. So it's a watch this space, but it's something I'm sure you guys will be talking about in terms of what action can people take or what other alternatives. We've had years before where we've come across these situations.
But it isn't just weather that's going to have impacted this, is it? We've seen SFI being pulled in March. Now that's probably going to have had an impact, I would think, on spring planting. But also something around, you touched on oilseed rape. That isn't just impacted by weather, is it? There can be,
No, it's been
other challenges. Putting it mildly, I think.
Yeah, oilseed rape has had a very challenging few years with pest pressure, cost pressure, and that whole risk-reward debate and how taking the risk with oilseed rape doesn't always stack up for people now, much less so than it did before. Again, we've seen another sharp pullback in the area of oilseed rape, coming down 19% from last year's very low level. And when we look ahead, prices for next harvest are very, very similar to where prices for this harvest were a year ago, so when people were making those decisions. But something that I can say is that at the cereals event, AHDB has launched a new top tips for managing cabbage stem flea beetle, one of the main pests in oilseed rape. And as an industry collaboration, putting that together, looking to ways to try and help people manage that situation and make oilseed rape perform better as a break crop that we really need. So probably the next one to look out for from our point of view will be the crop condition report, our sort of monthly update on how things are looking. That will be out on Friday the 27th of June, and hopefully will give us some insights into, firstly, what impact the rains had, and also in terms of crop development, what we might be looking like in terms of harvest timing. And then once harvest actually gets underway, we'll be having our regular harvest progress reports as well.
So if you're attending cereals, make sure to pop along to the AHDB stand. I'm sure there'll be lots of information there. And yeah, just to clarify, the planting and varieties survey is now out as of release of this podcast.
And on that note, it's time for our next break. We'll see you shortly.
If you're in the market for another podcast to subscribe to, then look no further than our Manager's Special, AHDB's Food and Farming podcast. Recent episodes include a consumer insight offering on red meat labels and supermarket aisles, as well as a dairy special about our work with retailers to promote milk. If you're after herbs, or rather herbal lays, our shelves are stacked with sage advice on how to introduce lucerne and clover into your fields. In fact, we cater for all tastes, so you'll find sections dedicated to all sectors: pork, cereals and oilseeds, dairy, and beef and lamb. And don't forget our middle aisle, where you can often pick up a bargain episode you didn't know you needed to listen to. Search Food and Farming wherever you get your podcasts. AHDB thanks you for your custom.
Welcome back to Agonomics with me, Hannah, Charlotte and Tom. And that was a really interesting session, wasn't it, with Helen on the planting and variety survey. I have a story about cabbage stem flea beetle. So for a period of time, shortly after uni, I lived in a caravan on the edge of an oilseed rape field. During the summer, you could not keep the little, because they're tiny little black bugs, and they would just get in every single nook and cranny and crack in the caravan. I mean, caravans are not the most watertight of places, but yeah. Hey, means to an end.
They're not beetle proof, is what you're trying to say.
No, they are not beetle proof. Hornets as well is another one. But yeah, you'd wake up in the morning and they'd be little tiny black dots just moving around the ceiling.
You're making me itch.
So we thought this podcast, and we're shaking up the format a bit, we thought it would be a great opportunity to have some questions. And if you've got a question that you were always too scared to ask, we thought now is the time we could try and answer it or find an expert that could answer it. So Martin, I think you've got a question from the inbox.
Yeah, producer Martin here. I hope you're not expecting me to be the expert. I'm just going to be the one that's asking the question. So here we go. I've always wanted to know how accurate market forecasts actually are and whether I should trust them when making business decisions.
That's a massive question, isn't it?
Just a small topic.
We do quite a lot of forecasting here at AHDB. Several times a year, we produce our market forecasts for production for red meat, dairy, and cereals and oilseeds. You may have seen online our Agri-Market Outlook, as it's called, and that contains our forecasts for production, consumption, imports and exports, and there's a little bit of price discussion as well for the sectors that we cover. And it's a really interesting question on how accurate forecasting is and how much you can lean on the forecasts for your business. One thing that we are very proud of and that we exist for is for evidence and for bringing facts and statistics from various sources into our forecasting. No one knows ultimately what's going to happen in markets, right? But we can bring together the best insight and the best evidence we have to make evidence-based assessments on where we think the markets are going to go.
I think the really important thing to flag here is we look at these and we don't go, this is set in stone, this is definitely what's going to happen. If we suddenly see that a market has changed, out of the blue almost, or trade tariffs have changed, or there's been a disease outbreak of some description, that is when we go back in and go, actually, do we think where we were expecting the market to be going to still be in that trajectory, or actually has that changed? And I think that's really important, that any sort of forecasting that you're looking at, you have to remember it is based on a snapshot in time.
It's a really valuable exercise to look at your forecasts and essentially mark your homework and see what you were forecasting based on the evidence at the time and where the market has moved.
But it's important to remember that every farm is different. Every supply chain, and by that I mean every individual supply chain is different. So when we come up with a forecast, it will be based off a overall estimate of an industry, whether that be your red meat, your cereals and oilseeds, or possibly some retail consumer insights. It's important for that to be based off your specific supply chain, your specific farming enterprises, and to be able to make a decision based off that. Always best to go off your own historical data than use forecasts. However, they are extremely important to be able to make those forward decisions yourself.
Absolutely. Benchmarking your own enterprise and your own business is so important. And I'd like to think that our sort of sector level forecasts are useful context for the industry, for producers, for processors, for levy payers to take that back to their own business and sort of see, right, what's the wider market doing? Because we don't only comment on UK dynamics, we also comment on the globe, and we're increasingly exposed to global markets, dairy, pig meat being key example, sheep meat, well, beef, all of them really. We're all connected to the globe in various different ways, and so having that context I think is really important. They're only as good as the data that feeds into them, which I think is a really important point to make. And if we're on a podcast talking about data and data quality, the quality of data going into any forecast, whether it's from HDB, whether it's from the likes of Anderson's, anyone in the industry that's producing forecasts is so important. But I think the fact that we're impartial, we're evidence-based, gives kudos to forecasts. We're never going to get them exactly right, and they should be used as a bit of a guideline. And we welcome feedback on any of our content, on our forecasts.
That's also why it's so important for people to go to and reply to the planting and variety surveys or any of the content which we are looking to put out. It's only as good as the information that you're able to give us. So if you are able to feed into any of these pieces of work that we do, please do. It's going to make our forecasting more accurate and therefore more useful to you.
So just goes to show with our, for example, our planting and varieties survey, a big thank you to the farmers that did respond to that, as that gives not just us but the industry valuable insight into what farmers and the supply chain can do in terms of making decisions for the future and hopefully making their decisions with more confidence.
So on that note, I think it's a great place to wrap up for today. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this whistle-stop tour through everything we've covered. If you have a question that you would like to submit, please do send us an email. Equally, if you have any topics you'd love for us to cover, we are always open to suggestions. So drop us an email to agronomics@ahdb.org.uk. If you want to find out more information on the top 10 tips for managing cabbage stem flea beetles, check out the AHDB website. So that's ahdb.org.uk. And make sure you are subscribed to the podcast wherever you may listen to us. New podcasts are released every Wednesday at midday.
See you next week.
Bye.